Hi, I'm Graham Wood and I'm speaking to you from Tasmania in Australia. We in Australia are going to vote soon on a referendum, and that referendum question is an important question for Australian society. There is a lot of people saying a lot of things in this debate as we approach the referendum, but my personal view is that there's not enough reasoning being undertaken. There are reasons that people hold the positions they do, and sometimes these reasons are not being acknowledged. So what I hope to do in this presentation is simply to offer some thoughts about the reasons behind different positions, in the hope that people might engage with the reasons that are relevant. You might think about your own reasoning, and you might think about the reasoning of others. You may wish to engage in discussion with others about why they hold the positions they do. So I hope that this presentation will help us all engage in some respectful and constructive discussions as we all reflect upon what way we choose to vote. Here is the referendum question. A proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve of this proposed alteration? Some people approve of it, some people do not. So let's explore the landscape so we might understand both our own position and perhaps the position of others. Here is a representation that I'm going to use to represent different people or different groups of people that live in Australia. There's a range of people who have a range of experiences and backgrounds that live in this country. And we can separate out those different people or groups of people into categories. Now, these categories don't necessarily define these people essentially, but these categories have been discussed in the debate, so I think they're worth reflecting upon. So notice that on the outset, one can think of people as individuals, or one can think of people as members of groups. Both ways of thinking about people are useful to some extent, but they don't necessarily essentially define us. They are just useful ways of engaging with these concepts. So notice I've separated out the population of Australia into individuals who are experiencing poor life outcomes. And that can be defined in a number of different ways, but perhaps it might be level of educational attainment or overall health. And it's sad, but there are people in our community that don't have the life outcomes that we might expect. I'm going to call those poor life outcomes. And in contrast to poor life outcomes, there are other life outcomes. They might not necessarily be great outcomes, but let's contrast them with particularly poor outcomes. And we can also separate out the Australian people into Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians and other Australians. Again, I don't want to sort of essentialise these differences, but the debate is talking about these differences, so they're worth thinking about. And one of the groups of people that are referred to quite regularly in this debate are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians who have poor life outcomes. And that's not necessarily any fault of their own. The circumstances they find themselves in might be such that they are not living the flourishing lives that they might hope for. Notice that that's an intersection of people with poor outcomes and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Importantly, not all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have poor life outcomes. Some of them may be living flourishing lives, I'm sure. But it's this intersection that seems to have been a focus of some interest. So some would suggest that the creation of the voice is justified by the hope that the voice might help these people. And that might be a reason to create the voice as it's being proposed. So reflect upon whether you think the possibility of helping those people will justify the voice, because that's a reason for you to vote yes. But notice that there are other Australians who also have poor life outcomes. Again, through no fault of their own, they might find that they haven't had the opportunities or they've faced disadvantage such that their life outcomes are not what we might have hoped for. I personally hope for everybody in Australia to have a flourishing life, but sometimes that doesn't happen. So some people might look at this cohort of Australians and say, these are the people that we should be helping. But notice, of course, that this crosses the divide between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, other Australians. So this observation might put some pressure on the idea of creating a voice in order to help people with poor outcomes. Because there's a range of people across a range of groups in Australia that are facing these challenges. So notice that the focus on one group might say, yeah, okay, we need to create this voice. But then focusing on a different, wider group might raise some questions. I'm not saying which is right or wrong. I'm simply inviting you to reflect upon the differences that I'm offering you today in order to help you understand the issues such that you might find reasons for voting yes or no. Another cohort of people that we can find in the Australian population is all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So notice that some of them might be having poor life outcomes, but some of them might be having flourishing and rewarding lives. Would this cohort be the foundation of a reason to vote yes in the referendum? So notice that these are not just the people with poor outcomes, but all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. If you're motivated to vote yes in the referendum when you're reflecting upon these people, it can't only be because of poor life outcomes. There must be some other justification. So again, I'm not trying to convince you what the right answer is. What I'm trying to invite you to do is reflect upon your reasons for making the choice you did. So what might justify giving a voice to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? It might be based on some reasoning associated with the time that individual people arrived or occupied this land. Some Australians have arrived very, very recently. Some of them have come freely as people able to pursue a life in Australia. Others have come as refugees, fleeing difficulties in their own lands. So there are many people who have arrived in this land over a wide, very wide space of time. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been here for tens of thousands of years. There are more recent arrivals who have come, I'm sure, last week. So what is it about a particular cohort of people that might justify a voice as suggested in this referendum? And this is worth thinking about in depth. What is it about one cohort of people that justifies a voice that other people don't have? Notice that it's not about disadvantage. There are people who have arrived very recently, perhaps migrant and refugee populations who have faced challenges. So it's not about disadvantage as such. It seems to be justified by something else. So this might be about the distinction between people whose ancestors have been here for a very long time versus people whose ancestors arrived more recently. So think about what might justify that distinction. You might find justification in the idea that people whose ancestors have been here a very long time have a special status with respect to this land, as opposed to people who have come more recently. And often what is discussed in this context is the fact that Indigenous Australians were dispossessed of their land. And that might be a reason for you to say, oh, that gives them a special status such that it's justified to vote yes. That might be the reason you vote yes. But it's also possible that you think, I'm not sure if that is a justification for a particular status in the Constitution. What is it about the history of our land that makes that cohort of people special in the way that the voice would recognise? Again, I'm not trying to convince you either way. What I'm trying to do is make explicit the reasons you might choose to vote one way or the other. You might want to reflect upon the entire history of the planet. Humans have moved across this land in various ways over various periods of time. It might be that the dispossession of the land from Indigenous people was reasonably recent, in that it was sort of less than 300 years ago. So is that significant? Is that what makes a difference? So notice there has been dispossession of lands throughout human history. The Normans' conquest of the British Isles presumably displaced Anglo-Saxon communities. And I'm sure there are examples throughout history. That was a very long time ago. So maybe the relevant difference is that this is recent and that somehow that makes a difference. Again, not trying to say this is the right or wrong way to think about this. I'm simply asking you to reflect upon your reasons for holding the position you do. It's certainly the case that this intersection of poor life outcomes and being an Aboriginal or a Torres Strait Islander person has been the focus of the debate. The question is that the right way to think about this debate, or are there other ways to think about it? Ultimately, there are many different ways that you could sort of separate out various groups. But notice also that it's possible to think in terms of individuals. So there is some tension between the idea of thinking in terms of individuals and thinking in terms of groups. And it's also to reflect upon your reasons for thinking in terms of individuals or thinking in terms of groups. Sometimes there's good reason to think in terms of individuals. Other times there might be good reasons to think in terms of groups. So again, I invite you to think about your reasons for either thinking in terms of groups, maybe the group of people with poor life outcomes who are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, or the reason you might think of all Australians as individuals. What's your reasoning behind either position? So, I hope this has given you some insight into the way that you can unpack the reasons behind your position for voting on the Voice to Parliament referendum.